The year is 1519, and across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, two worlds are about to collide in a confrontation that will reshape the course of human history forever. On one side stands the mighty Aztec Empire, a civilization of breathtaking complexity, architectural wonder, and military prowess that has dominated Mesoamerica for nearly 2 centuries, and on the other, a small band of Spanish conquistadors led by a man whose ambition knows no bounds, Hernán Cortés, a figure who will become both hero and villain depending on which side of history one chooses to stand. The story of the fall of the Aztec Empire is not simply a tale of conquest and defeat. It is a narrative woven with threads of diplomacy and betrayal, of cultural misunderstanding and calculated manipulation, of prophecy and coincidence, of disease and warfare, of love and treachery, and ultimately, of the tragic collision between two vastly different worldviews that could never truly coexist in the same space and time. To understand how an empire of millions fell to a force of mere hundreds, we must journey back to the heart of the Aztec world, to the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan, rising from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a jewel of impossible beauty, its pyramids touching the sky, its causeways stretching across the water like stone serpents, its markets bustling with the commerce of 1,000 subject peoples, its temples running red with the blood of sacrificial victims offered to gods whose hunger seemed never satisfied. This is where our story truly begins, not with the arrival of the Spanish, but with the man who would face them, the Emperor Montezuma II, known in his own language as Moctezuma II, the younger, the stern, the wrathful lord who had expanded his empire to its greatest extent yet who would preside over its most catastrophic collapse. Montezuma was not born to rule. He was the son of the Emperor Cuauhtémoc, but not the heir apparent, and he spent his early years as a priest and warrior, proving himself in battle against the restless subject peoples who constantly tested Aztec dominance, earning his reputation through martial skill and religious devotion, ascending to the throne in 1502 at the age of approximately 34 years. His reign began with auspicious signs and continued with military victories. He extended Aztec control deep into what is now Oaxaca and intensified the tributary system that brought wealth flowing into Tenochtitlan from every corner of the empire. Yet even as his power grew, strange omens began to trouble the emperor and his priests, omens that would later be interpreted as harbingers of doom. The Aztec worldview was fundamentally different from that of the Europeans who would soon arrive. The Aztecs conceived of time as cyclical rather than linear, believing that the world had been created and destroyed 4 times before, and that they lived in the 5th sun, an age that would also inevitably end in catastrophe. Their religion demanded constant human sacrifice to maintain cosmic order, to feed the sun god Huitzilopochtli so that he might continue his daily battle against darkness, to ensure that the universe itself did not simply cease to function. What the Spanish would see as barbarism was, to the Aztecs, the highest form of piety, the most sacred duty, the price of existence itself. Into this complex world of blood and beauty, of rigid hierarchy and cosmic anxiety, Hernán Cortés was about to intrude, and he could not have been more different from the people he was about to encounter. Born in 1485 in Medellín, Spain, to a family of minor nobility fallen on hard times, Cortés grew up in an age when Spain itself was being transformed, when the final Muslim kingdom of Granada fell in 1492, when Christopher Columbus returned with tales of a new world ripe for conquest and conversion, when the Spanish crown was consolidating power and projecting it across the seas in search of gold, glory, and God. Cortés studied law briefly at the University of Salamanca but abandoned his education, drawn instead by the lure of adventure in the Americas. At age 19, he sailed to Hispaniola, the island that would later be divided into Haiti and the Dominican Republic, where he worked as a notary and farmer, restless and ambitious, hungry for something greater than the life of a colonial administrator. His opportunity came in 1511 when he participated in the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez, distinguishing himself sufficiently to be rewarded with land and indigenous slaves. But Cortés wanted more than to be a comfortable colonist growing wealthy on the labor of others. He wanted to write his name in history, to achieve something that would echo through the ages, and when rumors reached Cuba of a wealthy civilization on the mainland, of cities of gold and vast armies, he saw his chance. In 1518, Velázquez commissioned Cortés to lead an expedition to explore and trade with the mainland. But as Cortés began assembling his force, recruiting men, purchasing ships, and gathering supplies with his own money and borrowed funds, Velázquez grew suspicious of his lieutenant's ambitions and attempted to rescind the commission. Cortés, however, was not a man to let opportunity slip through his fingers. In an act of calculated insubordination that bordered on mutiny, he set sail before Velázquez could stop him, departing Cuba on February 18, 1519, with 11 ships, approximately 500 soldiers, 13 horses, several cannons, and a determination that would carry him through impossible odds. The force that Cortés commanded seems laughably small when measured against the empire he was about to challenge, but it possessed advantages that went beyond mere numbers. The Spanish had steel swords and armor, firearms and crossbows, horses which were unknown in the Americas and struck terror into those who first encountered them, mastiffs trained for war, and perhaps most importantly, a unity of purpose forged by religious fervor and greed for gold that made them willing to risk everything for the chance of unimaginable wealth. On March 4, 1519, the expedition made landfall at the island of Cozumel off the Yucatan coast, where Cortés demonstrated both his diplomatic cunning and his religious zeal by rescuing a Spanish priest, Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked years earlier and lived among the Maya, learning their language and customs. Aguilar would prove invaluable as a translator, but he was only the first piece of Cortés's communication network. Moving along the coast, the expedition fought a battle with the Maya at Patoncan, emerging victorious, and among the tribute offered by the defeated was a group of 20 enslaved women, one of whom would change the course of history more profoundly than perhaps any other single individual in this drama. Malinche, known to the Spanish as Dona Marina and to history as La Malinche, a name that in modern Mexico has become synonymous with betrayal yet whose true story is far more complex and tragic than simple villainy. Malinche was a noblewoman, born to a family of the Nahua people, but she had been sold into slavery as a child after her father's death when her mother remarried and wished to secure her new son's inheritance. She had been passed from Maya to Maya, learning languages with each transaction, and by the time she entered Cortés's possession, she spoke both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Yucatec Maya, which Aguilar had learned. Through this chain of translation, Nahuatl to Maya to Spanish, Cortés could communicate with the people of central Mexico. But Malinche quickly learned Spanish herself, becoming not just a translator but an advisor, diplomat, and cultural interpreter who understood both the indigenous world she came from and the Spanish world she now inhabited. She became Cortés's lover, bore him a son, and used her position to navigate between two worlds while seeking survival and advancement in circumstances where she had no real power to control her own destiny. On April 21, 1519, Cortés founded the settlement of Villa Rica de la Veracruz, the rich town of the True Cross, establishing a municipality independent of Velázquez's authority in Cuba, having himself elected as Captain General by the men, and writing directly to King Charles I of Spain to legitimize his expedition. It was a masterful piece of legal maneuvering that transformed him from a rebellious subordinate into an independent conquistador answerable only to the crown itself. It was here at Veracruz that Cortés received the first delegation from Moctezuma, sent by the emperor to investigate these strange beings who had appeared on his coast, riding giant deer, commanding thunder and lightning, possessing faces the color of sun-bleached bone. The Aztec emissaries brought gifts of gold and rich cloth, hoping perhaps to satisfy the strangers and send them away, but their generosity had precisely the opposite effect, inflaming Spanish greed and confirming that there was indeed a wealthy empire waiting to be plundered. The question of what Montezuma thought when he first received reports of the Spanish has been debated by historians for centuries. Later Spanish sources claimed that Montezuma believed Cortés to be the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, who according to some versions of Aztec mythology had been banished from the earth but prophesied to return in the year Cuauhtémoc 1 read, which in the European calendar corresponded to 1519. This narrative served Spanish purposes well, explaining how a few hundred men could overcome an empire by suggesting that the Aztecs were paralyzed by religious awe, but modern scholars question this interpretation, noting that indigenous sources written after the conquest and Spanish accounts written during it often contradict each other. What seems more likely is that Montezuma was uncertain, cautious, trying to understand these strangers and their intentions, sending gifts to assess their desires, gathering information before committing to a course of action, behaving not as a man frozen by superstitious terror but as a ruler navigating a situation unprecedented in Aztec experience. Nevertheless, something in Montezuma's response was fatal to his empire's survival. Whether from uncertainty, diplomatic calculation, or religious anxiety, he neither attacked the Spanish immediately with overwhelming force nor embraced them wholeheartedly, but instead vacillated, sending gifts that advertised his wealth while sending messages that the strangers were not welcome in his capital, creating a situation that Cortés would exploit with devastating effectiveness. Before marching inland, Cortés made a decision that demonstrated both his commitment to his enterprise and his understanding of human psychology. He ordered his ships run aground and stripped of their useful materials, effectively destroying his fleet and eliminating any possibility of retreat. The message to his men was clear. There was no going back, only forward to victory or death, and this act of burning his bridges, quite literally, would become one of the most famous moments of the conquest. Though historians debate whether he actually burned the ships or merely dismantled them, the symbolic power remains unchanged. With approximately 400 soldiers, 15 horses, and a growing force of indigenous allies, Cortés began his march inland toward Tenochtitlan in August 1519, but he did not march directly to the Aztec capital. Instead, he took a route that would lead him through the territory of the Tlaxcalans, a confederation of city-states that had resisted Aztec domination for decades and saw in the Spanish potential allies against their hated enemies. The initial contact with Tlaxcala was hostile. The Tlaxcalans attacked the Spanish column repeatedly, testing these strangers in battle, and while Spanish accounts emphasized their own military superiority, the reality was that Cortés's force was in grave danger, facing armies that numbered in the thousands while his own men were exhausted, wounded, and running low on supplies. What saved the Spanish was not military might alone but Cortés's diplomatic genius. He convinced the Tlaxcalan leaders that an alliance would serve their interests, that together they could humble the Aztecs who had oppressed them for so long, and the Tlaxcalans, pragmatic and bitter from years of conflict with Tenochtitlan, agreed, providing Cortés with thousands of warriors, supplies, and intelligence about Aztec military capabilities and political divisions. This alliance was the true turning point in the conquest, more significant than any battle, because it revealed the fundamental weakness of the Aztec Empire. It was not a unified state but a collection of subject peoples held together by tribute, fear, and military force, and many of those peoples hated their Aztec overlords with an intensity that made them willing to ally with complete strangers if it offered a chance at revenge or independence. As Cortés marched toward Tenochtitlan, he passed through the rival city of Cholula, an important religious center allied with the Aztecs, and here occurred one of the most controversial episodes of the conquest. Cortés claimed he had discovered a plot by the Colonials to massacre the Spanish on Montezuma's orders, and in response, he orchestrated a preemptive strike, gathering the Colonial nobles in a courtyard and then unleashing his soldiers and Tlaxcalan allies in a slaughter that killed thousands, transforming the city's main plaza into an abattoir and sending a message that reverberated throughout the region. The Spanish would respond to any threat, real or perceived, with overwhelming and merciless violence. Whether the plot was real or fabricated remains uncertain. Some sources suggest it was a story planted by the Tlaxcalans to engineer the destruction of their religious rival, while others indicate there was genuine evidence of Aztec treachery. But regardless of the truth, the massacre at Cholula served Cortés's purposes perfectly, demonstrating Spanish ruthlessness while binding his indigenous allies to him through shared blood guilt. On November 8, 1519, Hernán Cortés and Montezuma II met face-to-face for the first time, and the encounter was laden with a ceremonial formality that masked the deadly tension beneath. The Spanish column had crossed one of the great causeways that connected the island city of Tenochtitlan to the mainland, and as they approached, the conquistadors were stunned by what they saw. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortés's soldiers who would later write an eyewitness account of the conquest, described Tenochtitlan as more magnificent than any city in Europe, with its white-plastered buildings gleaming in the sun, its massive pyramids dominating the skyline, its orderly streets and canals, its vast marketplace where 60,000 people gathered daily to trade goods from across the empire. The Spanish, most of whom were from small towns in Spain, had never seen anything to compare with this metropolis of perhaps 200,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Montezuma came forth to greet Cortés with great ceremony, carried on a litter and accompanied by his nobles, and the emperor and the conquistador exchanged gifts and elaborate courtesies through Malinche's translation. Cortés gave Montezuma a necklace of glass beads, and Montezuma hung around Cortés's neck precious necklaces of gold and jade while ordering his people to provide the Spanish with lavish accommodations in the palace of his father Quetzalcoatl. For several days, the Spanish were treated as honored guests, allowed to move about the city, to visit the Great Pyramid of Huitzilopochtli where they were horrified by the blood-encrusted altars and walls, to tour the marketplace and see the incredible variety of goods available, to witness the majesty and horror of Aztec civilization in all its complexity. But beneath the surface hospitality, both sides were deeply uneasy, each trying to understand the other's intentions, each aware that the situation could explode into violence at any moment. Cortés understood that his position was extremely precarious. He was in the heart of an enemy city, surrounded by potentially hostile forces that vastly outnumbered his small band of soldiers, with his only escape route along causeways that could be easily cut or defended, and any Aztec decision to attack would likely result in the complete annihilation of his force. What happened next was either an act of audacious genius or reckless insanity depending on one's perspective. 1 week after his arrival in Tenochtitlan, Cortés made the astonishing decision to take Montezuma hostage, to effectively imprison the emperor in his own palace and rule the Aztec Empire through him as a puppet. The pretext was an attack on a Spanish garrison on the coast, which Cortés blamed on Montezuma's orders, though the emperor denied any involvement. Confronting Montezuma in his palace with a small group of soldiers, Cortés demanded that the emperor come to stay in the Spanish quarters for his own protection, and after hours of tense negotiation, Montezuma agreed, whether because he feared immediate violence against himself, because he hoped to maintain control of the situation by appearing to cooperate, or because he was paralyzed by uncertainty about these strangers and their powers, we cannot know with certainty. For approximately 7 months, from November 1519 to June 1520, the Aztec Empire was effectively ruled by a Spanish force of a few hundred men, who controlled the emperor and through him issued orders, demanded gold, and gradually accumulated more wealth and information about the empire they intended to conquer. Montezuma's captivity has puzzled historians for centuries because the emperor commanded thousands of warriors who could have overwhelmed the Spanish at any time. Yet he did not order an attack, did not attempt escape, but instead cooperated with his captors, even appearing in public to reassure his people and ordering them to obey the Spanish. Some scholars suggest that Montezuma was playing a longer game, trying to manipulate the Spanish while maintaining his authority and waiting for an opportunity to turn the tables, while others argue that he had genuinely lost the initiative and found himself trapped by his own earlier decisions and by the rigid protocols of Aztec kingship that made it difficult for him to act decisively in such an unprecedented situation. The uneasy balance in Tenochtitlan was shattered by news from the coast. In April 1520, a Spanish force of approximately 1,400 men under Pánfilo de Narváez had arrived from Cuba, sent by Diego Velázquez to arrest Cortés for his insubordination and take control of the conquest for the Cuban governor. Cortés faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had achieved. If Narvaez succeeded in capturing him, Cortés would be returned to Cuba in chains, disgraced, and probably imprisoned. All his ambitions turned to ashes, but Cortés was never more dangerous than when he was cornered. Leaving Pedro de Alvarado, one of his most trusted but also most violent and impulsive lieutenants, in command of approximately 80 men in Tenochtitlan with orders to hold the city and maintain control of Montezuma, Cortés marched to the coast with the majority of his force, moving with stunning speed through difficult terrain to confront Narvaez before the new arrival could consolidate his position. In a daring night attack on May 27, 1520, Cortés's much smaller force surprised Narvaez's camp, captured the commander, who lost an eye in the fighting, and through a combination of violence and persuasion convinced most of Narvaez's soldiers to join him, instantly tripling his army and transforming a threat into an asset. It was a masterful piece of military and political maneuvering that demonstrated why Cortés was so formidable. But while he was winning this victory on the coast, disaster was unfolding in Tenochtitlan. Pedro de Alvarado, left in command in the capital, made a decision that would prove catastrophic. The Aztecs were preparing to celebrate the festival of Tlaxcala, one of their most important religious ceremonies, and thousands of nobles and warriors gathered in the courtyard of the main temple, unarmed in accordance with religious custom, to perform ritual dances and ceremonies. Alvarado later claimed he had discovered evidence of a plot against the Spanish and acted to prevent it. But what happened next suggests either panic, paranoia, or premeditated massacre. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies surrounded the courtyard and attacked the celebrants, killing hundreds of unarmed nobles in a slaughter that shocked and enraged the city. The Tlaxcala massacre, as it came to be known, destroyed any remaining possibility of peaceful coexistence between the Spanish and the Aztecs. The city erupted in fury, Aztec warriors attacked the Spanish quarters, and Alvarado and his men found themselves besieged, trapped in the palace with their prisoners, including Montezuma, fighting desperately to survive until Cortés could return. When Cortés arrived back in Tenochtitlan on June 24, 1520, with his enlarged army, he found a city transformed from uncertain host to implacable enemy. The causeways were damaged, the markets were closed, and an ominous silence hung over the city as thousands of Aztec warriors prepared for battle. Cortés attempted to restore order by having Montezuma address his people from the palace roof, urging them to stand down and make peace with the Spanish, but the emperor's words were met with jeers, insults, and stones. The Aztecs had lost all respect for their captive ruler, seeing him as a traitor and a puppet, and during this confrontation, Montezuma was struck by stones thrown by his own people, suffering wounds that would prove fatal, though controversy surrounds his exact death, with Spanish sources claiming he died from these wounds inflicted by his own subjects, while indigenous accounts suggest he was murdered by the Spanish when he ceased to be useful to them. With Montezuma dead or dying and the city in open revolt, Cortés faced the reality that he could no longer hold Tenochtitlan. His position was untenable, surrounded by a vast enemy army in the heart of a hostile city with limited supplies and no possibility of reinforcement. And on the night of June 30th, 1520, he ordered a retreat, planning to evacuate the city under cover of darkness and fight his way across the causeway to the mainland. What followed was the Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, one of the most disastrous episodes in Spanish colonial history. As the conquistadors and their allies attempted to escape, loaded down with looted gold and treasure, the Aztecs attacked in overwhelming numbers, fighting with desperate fury from canoes in the lake and on the causeway itself. The causeway became a nightmarish gauntlet of death. The Spanish, weighed down by their armor and stolen gold, were pulled into the water and drowned, shot with arrows, captured and dragged away for sacrifice, while their Tlaxcalan allies died by the hundreds. The portable bridge the Spanish had constructed to cross gaps in the causeway collapsed under the weight of men and treasure, creating a choke point where bodies piled up and the slaughter intensified. By dawn, When the survivors reached the mainland at Tacuba, Cortés had lost perhaps 600 of his Spanish soldiers, thousands of his indigenous allies, all his cannons and most of his firearms, most of his horses, and virtually all the treasure they had accumulated. Bernal Diaz reported seeing Cortés sitting beneath a tree, weeping for his losses, though whether from grief for his dead companions or frustration at his shattered ambitions, we cannot know. The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies, exhausted, wounded, and demoralized, retreated eastward toward Tlaxcala, pursued by Aztec forces determined to annihilate them completely. On July 8, 1520, at Otumba, a plain northeast of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish column was surrounded by a massive Aztec army estimated at 20,000 to 40,000 warriors who seemed poised to complete the destruction begun on the Noche Triste. The Battle of Otumba should have been the end of the Spanish conquest. Cortés's force was outnumbered 20 to 1 or more. His men were exhausted and wounded. He had lost most of his weapons and horses, and the Aztecs were fighting with the confidence of recent victory and the determination to avenge their dead. Yet somehow, through a combination of desperate courage, tactical flexibility, and extraordinary luck, the Spanish won. Cortés led a cavalry charge directly at the Aztec command center, killing or capturing the enemy commanders and their standard-bearers, and when the great battle standards fell, the Aztec army, following the customs of Mesoamerican warfare where the fall of the standards signaled defeat, broke and retreated. It was one of the most improbable victories in military history, and it saved the Spanish from total destruction, allowing them to reach the safety of Tlaxcala where they could rest, recover, and plan their return. The Aztecs had won a great victory in driving the Spanish from Tenochtitlan, but they had also made a fatal error. They had not pursued the retreating Spanish with sufficient vigor, had not pressed their advantage to complete annihilation, perhaps because their military traditions emphasized capture for sacrifice over total destruction of the enemy, or perhaps because they believed the Spanish were sufficiently defeated that they would simply leave and never return. This miscalculation would prove fatal because Cortés was not a man to accept defeat. He spent the next year in Tlaxcala, recovering, recruiting, and planning a return to Tenochtitlan, but this time he would not rely on audacity and hostage-taking alone. He would conduct a proper siege, and to do that, he needed to control the lake. Cortés ordered the construction of 13 small sailing ships called brigantines, designed to be built in Tlaxcala and then disassembled, carried in pieces to Lake Texcoco, and reassembled there. This massive engineering project, supervised by a Spanish shipwright named Martín López, required cutting timber in the mountains, transporting it to Tlaxcala, constructing the vessels, and then organizing thousands of indigenous laborers to carry the components 50 miles to the lake, all while maintaining security against Aztec raids. While the brigantines were being built, Cortés was also busy with diplomacy and warfare, conquering or making alliances with cities around the lake, cutting off Tenochtitlan's supply lines, and building an alliance network that would provide him with tens of thousands of indigenous warriors for the final assault. The conquest was never simply Spanish versus Aztec, but rather a complex civil war in which many indigenous peoples saw the Spanish as useful allies in their own struggles against Aztec domination. In Tenochtitlan, the situation was also changing. After Montezuma's death, his brother Cuauhtémoc had been elected emperor and had organized the resistance that drove out the Spanish, but in December 1520, just 80 days after taking power, Cuauhtémoc died of smallpox, one of the first victims of the epidemic diseases that the Spanish had unknowingly brought with them from Europe. Smallpox, to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity, spread through central Mexico like wildfire, killing vast numbers of people, disrupting society, weakening the Aztec military, and creating a sense of despair and doom. The Aztecs could fight Spanish steel and Spanish horses, but how could they fight an invisible enemy that killed without mercy and seemed to spare the Europeans themselves, leading some to believe that even the gods had turned against them? Cuauhtémoc was succeeded by his cousin Cuauhtémoc, whose name means descending eagle, a young man in his mid-20s who would prove to be the last emperor of the Aztecs and one of history's great tragic heroes. Cuauhtémoc understood that the Spanish would return and prepared Tenochtitlan for a siege, stockpiling food and weapons, fortifying the city's defenses, and rallying his people for a fight to the death, because he recognized that this was not merely a war of conquest but a war of extermination, where the choice was between resistance and annihilation. On May 26, 1521, Cortés began his siege of Tenochtitlan with a force that included approximately 900 Spanish soldiers, but, more significantly, anywhere from 80,000 to 200,000 indigenous allies from Tlaxcala and other states that had thrown in their lot with the conquistadors. The 13 brigantines were launched on the lake, giving the Spanish control of the water and cutting off the city from outside supplies and reinforcements. The siege of Tenochtitlan lasted for 75 days and was one of the most brutal military operations in the history of the Americas. It was not a single battle but a grinding, block-by-block destruction of the city, as the Spanish and their allies advanced along the causeways, fighting for every foot of ground, filling in the canals to allow their advance and prevent ambush from canoes, while the brigantines dominated the lake, sinking Aztec canoes and preventing any supplies from reaching the besieged city. The Aztecs fought with extraordinary courage and determination, defending their city street by street, house by house, sometimes recapturing at night what they had lost during the day. But they were fighting a losing battle against overwhelming numbers, superior coordination, and most devastatingly, starvation and disease. As the siege progressed, conditions in Tenochtitlan became apocalyptic. Food supplies dwindled and then disappeared entirely, forcing the defenders to eat anything they could find, from grass and bark to leather and even adobe. The smallpox epidemic continued to rage, filling the streets with corpses that could not be properly buried. The city's freshwater supply was cut off, forcing people to drink the brackish, contaminated water of the lake. And the constant fighting filled the city with the wounded and dying, while the smell of death hung heavy in the air. Cuauhtémoc refused all offers to surrender, knowing that capitulation meant not just defeat but the end of the Aztec world, the destruction of everything his people had built, the extinction of their way of life. He rallied his warriors, led by example, and inspired a resistance that amazed and frustrated the Spanish, who had expected the city to fall quickly once the siege began, but found instead an enemy willing to die rather than submit. The Spanish advance was methodical and merciless. They systematically destroyed the city as they advanced, burning buildings, tearing down temples, filling in canals, transforming the magnificent capital into a field of rubble because Cortés had learned from the Noche Triste that standing structures could be used for defense and ambush, and because the destruction of the city was itself a psychological weapon, demonstrating that Aztec power and glory were being literally reduced to ruins. By early August 1521, the defenders had been compressed into a small section of the city, starving, diseased, and exhausted, but still fighting, and on August 13, 1521, the final assault began. The Spanish and their allies swept through the remaining defenses, and in the chaos, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape by canoe across the lake, hoping to continue resistance from another city, but he was captured by the crew of one of the brigantines. With Cuauhtémoc's capture, organized resistance collapsed. The surviving warriors laid down their weapons, and the conquest of Tenochtitlan was complete. The magnificent city that had awed the Spanish 2 years earlier was now a smoking ruin, its population decimated by war, famine, and disease, its temples destroyed, its treasures looted, its entire civilization on the brink of extinction. The fall of Tenochtitlan was not quite the end of the Aztec Empire. There were still Aztec-controlled territories that continued to resist, and the Spanish would spend years pacifying the region. But the symbolic and practical significance of the capital's fall was immense. The heart of the empire had stopped beating, and the rest of the body would inevitably follow. Cuauhtémoc was initially treated with respect by Cortés, who recognized the emperor's courage and hoped to use him to pacify the remaining resistance. But as the Spanish searched frantically for the legendary treasures of Moctezuma, which seemed to have disappeared during the siege, Cuauhtémoc and other Aztec nobles were tortured to reveal the location of the gold. According to accounts, Cuauhtémoc was burned on the feet and hands, subjected to agony to make him confess where the treasure was hidden, but he either did not know or refused to tell, and the torture yielded no significant results beyond demonstrating Spanish brutality and desperation. Cuauhtémoc was kept alive as a prisoner and puppet ruler for several years, used by Cortés to legitimize Spanish rule and help convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. But in 1525, during an expedition to Honduras, Cortés became convinced that Cuauhtémoc was plotting against him, possibly on the basis of false denunciations or perhaps from paranoia, and on February 28, 1525, Cuauhtémoc was hanged along with several other Aztec nobles, ending the life of a man who has become in Mexican history a symbol of indigenous resistance and dignity in the face of conquest. The reasons for the Aztec Empire's fall are complex and cannot be reduced to any single factor. It was not simply that the Spanish had superior technology, because while firearms, steel, and horses were advantages, they were not overwhelming against the vast numerical superiority of the Aztecs and their sophisticated military organization. Nor was it simply disease, although smallpox and other epidemics certainly played a crucial role by killing huge numbers of people, disrupting social organization, and creating psychological despair at a critical moment. But the epidemics were most devastating during and after the final siege, not before, when Spanish forces had already demonstrated they could compete militarily with the Aztecs. The key factor was political, specifically the Spanish ability to exploit the divisions within the Aztec Empire and build alliances with subject peoples who hated Aztec rule. Without the thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors and the support of other indigenous states, Cortés could never have conquered Tenochtitlan, could not have survived the Noche Triste, could not have mounted the final siege. The Aztecs were not conquered by Europeans alone, but by other indigenous peoples using Europeans as allies in their own rebellions against Aztec domination. And this fact is crucial to understanding the conquest, which was not a clash of civilizations in the abstract but a specific historical event shaped by local politics, personal decisions, cultural misunderstandings, and the contingencies of war. Montezuma's role in the fall of his empire has been debated endlessly. Was he a weak ruler paralyzed by superstition, a cunning diplomat outmaneuvered by a more ruthless opponent, a tragic figure trapped by circumstances beyond his control, or some combination of all three? The sources are contradictory and biased, written mostly by Spanish conquistadors seeking to justify their actions or by indigenous peoples writing after the conquest under Spanish rule. And the real Montezuma, his thoughts, fears, and intentions remain tantalizingly out of reach behind layers of propaganda and myth. What we can say is that he faced an unprecedented situation, dealing with strangers whose capabilities and intentions he could not fully understand, and that his decisions, particularly his failure to attack the Spanish immediately when they first arrived on his coast and his acquiescence to his own captivity, created opportunities that Cortés exploited brilliantly. Whether different decisions would have led to a different outcome, we cannot know, because history does not offer controlled experiments, but it is hard to imagine a scenario in which the Aztecs could have permanently resisted European expansion given the broader context of Spanish colonialism, European diseases, and the technological and organizational advantages that Europe had developed by the 16th century. The legacy of the conquest is written across Mexico and Latin America today. The fall of the Aztec Empire marked the beginning of 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule that fundamentally transformed the region, imposing Christianity, the Spanish language, European legal and social structures, and a racial hierarchy that privileged those of European descent while subjugating indigenous peoples and enslaving Africans brought across the Atlantic. The indigenous population of central Mexico, which may have numbered between 15 and 25 million before the conquest, collapsed to perhaps 1 million within a century. A demographic catastrophe caused primarily by epidemic diseases but also by warfare, forced labor, social disruption, and the destruction of traditional ways of life. Entire civilizations, languages, and cultural traditions were erased or driven underground, surviving only in fragments, in syncretized religious practices that blended Christianity with indigenous beliefs, in archaeological sites that whisper of vanished glories, and in the genetic and cultural heritage of modern Mexicans who carry within them the legacy of both the conquerors and the conquered. Hernán Cortés, the architect of this transformation, lived to see himself become fabulously wealthy and politically powerful, granted the title of Marqués del Valle de Oaxaca and given vast estates worked by indigenous laborers in a system of encomienda that was essentially feudalism transplanted to the New World. Yet despite his achievements, he was never fully trusted by the Spanish crown, which feared that successful conquistadors might establish independent kingdoms in the Americas. King Charles I received Cortés with honor but also kept him under surveillance, denied him the governorship of New Spain that he felt he deserved, and gradually sidelined him from power, replacing him with royal administrators who would be more obedient to Madrid. Cortés spent his later years fighting legal battles, trying to secure his privileges and those of his descendants, mounting failed expeditions to explore further territories, and watching as other men reaped the rewards of the empire he had conquered. He died in Spain in 1547 at the age of 62, wealthy but embittered, planning to return to Mexico but never making the journey, and his body was eventually interred in Mexico City, though his bones have been moved multiple times and their current location is disputed, as if even in death he cannot find rest in the land he conquered. Malinche, La Malinche, whose linguistic skills and cultural knowledge had been so crucial to Spanish success, bore Cortés a son, Martín Cortés, who was sometimes considered one of the first mestizos, people of mixed European and indigenous ancestry who would come to form the majority of Mexico's population. But Cortés eventually married her off to one of his soldiers, Juan Jaramillo, and she faded from the historical record, dying sometime before 1530, her final years and death as obscure as her early life had been. In Mexican history and culture, she has become a deeply controversial figure, sometimes portrayed as a traitor who betrayed her people to the Spanish, other times defended as a survivor who made the best of impossible circumstances. A woman who had no real agency in a world controlled by men but who used what limited power she possessed to survive and even to shape events. The debate over Malinche reflects broader Mexican struggles with the legacy of the conquest, the tension between indigenous and European heritage, the question of what it means to be Mexican when that identity was forged in violence and combines two worlds that collided so catastrophically in the 16th century. The physical city of Tenochtitlan was destroyed, its stones used to build Spanish churches and colonial buildings, its canals filled in, its lake gradually drained over centuries, and modern Mexico City now sprawls across the valley where the Aztec capital once rose from the waters. But occasionally, construction workers uncover remnants of the buried city, carved stones bearing images of gods who are no longer worshipped, foundations of buildings that housed a civilization that ceased to exist, fragments of a world that was ended in blood and fire. The Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, was demolished by the Spanish, and the Mexico City Cathedral was built partly from its stones. But in 1978, electrical workers accidentally discovered the remains of the pyramid's base, leading to archaeological excavations that have revealed thousands of artifacts and provided invaluable insights into Aztec civilization. Standing at the ruins of the Templo Mayor today, with the cathedral looming overhead, one can see the physical layering of history, the way one world was literally built upon the ruins of another, and the complex, painful legacy that Mexico inherited from the conquest. The fall of the Aztec Empire had consequences that extended far beyond Mexico. It demonstrated to other European powers that the Americas contained wealthy, sophisticated civilizations that could be conquered and exploited, setting off a wave of conquests across the hemisphere as Spanish conquistadors sought to replicate Cortés's success, from Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire in Peru to the gradual subjugation of Maya kingdoms in the Yucatan and Central America. The flood of gold and silver from the Americas transformed the European economy, fueled Spanish power in Europe, contributed to inflation and economic changes across the continent. and helped finance the wars and political struggles that would shape European history for centuries. In a very real sense, the conquest of the Americas made possible the rise of European global dominance, providing the wealth, resources, and confidence that allowed European powers to project their influence across the world. The intellectual impact was equally profound. Europeans had to grapple with the existence of peoples and civilizations they had never imagined, challenging their understanding of human history, biblical chronology, and the nature of human diversity. Debates raged about whether indigenous peoples had souls, whether they were fully human, whether it was legitimate to conquer and enslave them, and while these debates often served to justify conquest rather than prevent it, they also prompted some Europeans to question the morality of colonialism and to develop concepts of natural law and universal human rights that would, ironically, later be used to critique and ultimately dismantle European empires. The Aztec Empire that fell in 1521 was in many ways the culmination of centuries of Mesoamerican civilization, building on achievements that stretched back to the Olmecs, the Maya, the Teotihuacan, and other cultures that had developed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, architecture, agriculture, and social organization. The Aztecs inherited and refined these traditions, creating an empire that, at its height, controlled much of central Mexico, collected tribute from millions of people, maintained a complex bureaucracy, supported a sophisticated artistic and literary culture, and organized military forces that had conquered or held in check virtually all their neighbors. Yet this empire also contained the seeds of its own vulnerability. The very system of tribute and domination that made the Aztecs powerful also created resentment and hatred among subject peoples who were willing to ally with outsiders against their overlords, and the Aztec focus on ritual warfare and taking captives for sacrifice rather than on annihilating enemies may have made them less prepared for the total warfare that the Spanish brought to the Americas. The Aztec worldview, with its emphasis on cyclical time, cosmic instability, and the need for constant human sacrifice to maintain order, may have made it difficult for them to respond effectively to the unprecedented crisis of the Spanish arrival, though we must be careful about accepting Spanish claims that the Aztecs were paralyzed by superstition, because indigenous sources suggest that Aztec resistance was often fierce, strategic, and based on clear-eyed assessments of the military and political situation rather than on religious fatalism. What is clear is that the fall of the Aztec Empire was not inevitable, not predetermined by any inherent superiority of European civilization or any inherent weakness of indigenous civilizations, but was rather the result of specific historical circumstances, individual decisions, military innovations, epidemiological accidents, and political alliances that came together in a particular way at a particular moment to produce a catastrophic transformation. If Montezuma had attacked the Spanish immediately upon their arrival, if the Tlaxcalans had not allied with Cortés, if Cuauhtémoc had been able to unite all Mesoamerican peoples against the Spanish threat, if epidemic diseases had not ravaged the indigenous population at critical moments, if any one of dozens of contingent events had unfolded differently, the outcome might have been very different. The Spanish might have been driven back to their ships, Cortés might have died in battle or from disease, the conquest might have been delayed by decades or even centuries, allowing indigenous peoples more time to adapt to European weapons and tactics, to develop immunities to European diseases, or to learn about European weaknesses and how to exploit them. But history unfolded as it did, and by August 1521, the Aztec Empire was finished, its capital destroyed, its emperor captured, its gods seemingly powerless, its people facing a future under Spanish rule that would bring Christianity, new languages, new diseases, new forms of labor and social organization, and a racial hierarchy that would shape Latin American society for centuries. The story of Cortés and Montezuma, of the conquest of the Aztec Empire, is ultimately a story about the collision of worlds, about what happens when two civilizations that have developed in complete isolation from each other suddenly come into contact and find themselves in competition for the same territory, the same resources, the same future. It is a story about the role of individuals in history, How the decisions and characteristics of particular people, Cortés's ambition and tactical genius, Montezuma's uncertainty and caution, Malinche's linguistic skills and cultural navigation, Cuauhtémoc's courage and determination, shaped events in ways that affected millions of people and echoed down through centuries. It is also a story about the importance of alliance and division in determining the outcome of conflicts, how the Spanish victory was really an indigenous victory as much as a European one, achieved by Tlaxcalans and other peoples who saw the Spanish as tools for their own liberation from Aztec domination, even though they would soon discover that Spanish rule would prove even more oppressive than what they had overthrown. The tragic irony is that the indigenous peoples who allied with Cortés to destroy the Aztec Empire helped create the conditions for the destruction of their own independence and the subjugation of all indigenous peoples to European colonialism. The conquest is also a story about the power of disease to shape history, how microscopic organisms that the Spanish carried unknowingly in their bodies proved more destructive than all their weapons, killing millions and breaking the will of civilizations to resist, creating a biological catastrophe that was unprecedented in human history, and that demonstrates how interconnected human societies have become and how vulnerable we all are to pathogens against which we have no immunity. And finally, it is a story about the enduring questions of colonialism, conquest, and cultural destruction, about how we judge historical events and historical figures, about the tension between understanding the past in its own context and holding it accountable to universal moral standards, about how we remember and memorialize events that are simultaneously sources of pride and shame, triumph and tragedy, depending on one's perspective and heritage. In Mexico today, the conquest remains a living memory, not a distant historical event, because its consequences continue to shape Mexican society, politics, culture, and identity. The question of how to remember and commemorate the conquest has been intensely debated, with some emphasizing indigenous resistance and resilience, others focusing on the creation of a new mestizo identity that combines indigenous and European elements, and still others calling for recognition of the conquest as genocide and demanding apologies or reparations from Spain and the Catholic Church. In 2021, on the 500th anniversary of the fall of Tenochtitlan, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador called on Spain and the Vatican to apologize for the abuses committed during the conquest, a request that was refused by the Spanish government, which argued that historical events should be understood in their context rather than judged by contemporary standards, highlighting the continued difficulty of reconciling different narratives and different moral frameworks when confronting the legacy of colonialism. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was a pivotal moment in world history, marking the beginning of the European colonization of the Americas, the creation of the first major European empire in the Western Hemisphere, and the start of a process that would ultimately bring all of North and South America under European control, transforming not just the Americas but the entire world by initiating the Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, people, and cultures between the old world and the new world that would reshape global demographics, economics, agriculture, and ecology in ways that continue to affect us today. From the Aztec perspective, the conquest was the end of the world, literally the death of their fifth son, the destruction of everything they had known and valued, the triumph of alien gods and alien powers that seemed bent on erasing them from existence. Yet despite the catastrophe, indigenous peoples and cultures survived, adapted, resisted in countless small ways, preserved elements of their heritage, and eventually contributed to the creation of new identities and new nations in the Americas. The Aztecs may have lost their empire, but their descendants did not disappear. Millions of Mexicans today speak Nahuatl, maintain indigenous traditions, and identify proudly with their Aztec heritage, keeping alive the memory of a civilization that was destroyed but not entirely erased. And in this persistence, in this refusal to be completely conquered even in defeat, there is a kind of victory, a testimony to human resilience and the enduring power of culture to survive even the most devastating catastrophes. The story of the fall of the Aztec Empire reminds us that history is not simply the story of the powerful and the victorious, but also of the defeated and the dispossessed, whose suffering and loss must also be remembered and honored. It reminds us that civilizations are fragile, that achievements accumulated over centuries can be destroyed in years or even months, that the course of history can be changed by accidents, by diseases, by the decisions of individuals, by contingencies that no one could have predicted or controlled. It reminds us too that we must be careful about simple narratives of progress or superiority, about assuming that the winners of historical conflicts won because they were somehow better or more advanced rather than because they were luckier, more ruthless, or simply happened to have biological and technological advantages that they did not create themselves but inherited from their ancestors or from geographic and ecological circumstances. The Spanish did not conquer the Aztecs because Europeans were inherently superior to indigenous Americans, but because of a specific constellation of factors that came together at a specific moment to produce a specific outcome that was not inevitable and that might have been very different under slightly different circumstances. As we look back across 5 centuries at the events of 1519 to 1521, at the meeting of Cortés and Montezuma, at the Night of Sorrows and the siege of Tenochtitlan, at the capture of Cuauhtémoc and the fall of the Aztec Empire, we are confronted with the complexity of history, the way that it resists simple judgments, the way that tragedy and triumph are often inseparable, the way that the same events can be remembered so differently depending on whose perspective we adopt, and the way that the past continues to shape the present in ways both obvious and subtle, creating the world we inhabit and the challenges we face. The fall of the Aztec Empire is not just a story from the past, but a story that continues to reverberate through the present, influencing debates about colonialism and post-colonialism, about indigenous rights and cultural preservation, about historical memory and national identity, about the legacies of violence and the possibilities of reconciliation, about what we owe to the past and to those who suffered in it, and about how we can build societies that acknowledge historical injustices, while moving forward toward more just and equitable futures. And in grappling with these questions, in refusing to forget or simplify the past, in insisting on the full complexity and humanity of all the people involved, from conquistadors to emperors to indigenous allies to enslaved women who became interpreters and intermediaries, we honor the memory of those who lived through these events and ensure that their experiences, their choices, their suffering, and their resilience continue to teach us, to challenge us, and to remind us of both the worst and the best of which human beings are capable when confronted with the unknown, the unexpected, and the unprecedented transformations that mark the great turning points in the human story.